Karl Marx. Workers of all lands unite. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
When you hear the word conservatism, you think of what? Small government, individualism, free markets. But conservatism wasn't always like that. Well into the 19th century, conservatives defended the divine right of kings and were often fans of the state. The more libertarian kind of conservatism that we know today is a modern invention. So how did it come to be? Ideas, like people, don't grow up in isolation. Contemporary conservatism developed largely in reaction to the challenge of Marxism. In the late 19th century, and for much of the 20th, conservatives feared Marxism. They believed it would stir up the masses and crush individual liberty. So they came up with new ideas in order to beat it. Writing in 1848, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French political scientist, defined freedom in opposition to socialism. And at the heart of this contrast was the role of the state.
Democracy extends the sphere of individual freedom. Socialism restricts it. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man. Socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. Democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word: equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality in liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude.
Tocqueville had seen the effects on France and Europe of over half a century of revolution. And while most of his contemporaries thought revolution would lead to anarchy and chaos, Tocqueville saw
a longer and more secret road to serfdom.
Serfs used to be beholden to feudal barons. In the future, warned Tocqueville, they would be men and women enslaved by the state. Tocqueville's expression, road to serfdom, would give the title to one of the foundational books of 20th century right-wing thought, Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. The influential economist Milton Friedman had this to say about it.
His Road to Serfdom book, the one you have there, which was published 50 years ago, was really an amazing event when it came out. It's very hard to remember now what the attitude was in 1944 or 45. And throughout the Western world, the movement was towards centralization, planning, government control.
Hayek was an Austrian economist writing in the shadow of World War II. In The Road to Serfdom, he argued that attempts to plan the economy and use the state to make people more equal lead inevitably to Hitler or Stalin. After writing the book, Hayek spent decades in the wilderness, but in 1974 he was awarded a Nobel Prize for economics.
The whole idea that society can be made to behave according to human conceptions of individual morals is completely mistaken. It's a concept that just is not applicable to society.
Margaret Thatcher read The Road to Serfdom as an undergraduate at Oxford, and she absorbed deeply Hayek's idea that you cannot compromise with socialism, even in mild social democratic forms, because socialism leads us to totalitarianism by degrees. Former Conservative MP, now crossbench peer, Lord Patten.
Margaret Thatcher would, from time to time, pull little bits of paper with quotations on them out of her handbag, and Hayek would be one of them.
There you have it, the family tree of modern conservatism. Tocqueville influenced Hayek, Hayek influenced Friedman, and Friedman and Hayek influenced Margaret Thatcher. In the 1970s, Friedman and Thatcher were part of a conservative movement that we often call neoliberalism, and which would spread a revolution in libertarian economics and politics that is still felt across the world today. The story of that revolution spans a century and travels, sometimes unexpectedly, from the Soviet Union to America to Britain. What drives its characters is a deep-seated suspicion of the over-mighty socialist state, although they have more in common with socialists than you might think. Today, some of them might even have cause to miss their old Marxist enemies. This is, in part, a story of personal conversion, for a significant number of those on the right used to be on the left.
You know, the old joke is, if you're not a socialist by 18, you have no heart. If you're still a socialist by 28, you have no brain. And I just about made it in both cases.
Professor Deirdre McCloskey.
As Keynes said famously, when someone complained to him that Keynes had changed his opinions on free trade, he said, "When I get new evidence, I change my mind. What do you do?" I knew Eric Hobsbawm slightly. I was at Birkbeck for a year in London where he taught. And I was astonished that this very intelligent man, this excellent historian, was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain until a few months before it dissolved itself. I think it was in 1992. And it tells me that identities established when you're a teenager are just very powerful. Some people make their political choice when they're 16, and they don't ever change it.
Conviction is admirable. So is the willingness to think again. This subject is personal to me because when I was 16, my political choice was very much with the left. I was a Marxist until my early 20s, when I converted to Catholicism and moved rather dramatically to the right. One similarity between Catholicism and Marxism is that they both define how you see and interact with the world. David Aronovich talks here about the immersion in communist dogma.
And by the time I was sentient, we were a communist family in a communist community working on behalf of this democratic revolution. So I was brought up with a whole series of attitudes that were not predominant in us. In fact, they were more or less contrary. We were for things that other people were against. We were for Russia, when people thought Russia was a very bad thing. We were for militant trades unionists. We were in favour of strikes. We liked them. Pickets, we thought those were good too. We liked black people. And you've got to understand that in the context of Britain in the 1950s and 60s, that was relatively unusual.
David is now a Times columnist.
Which has, I have to admit, an incredible irony, because you don't get much more bourgeois when it comes to press than the Times.
Most of us see life coloured in shades of grey. Marxism sees it in black and white terms. You're either with us or against us, good versus evil. Ironically, many conservatives feel the same way. In the 20th century, they too came to see life in terms of good versus evil, as an almost religious struggle between the forces of light and dark. One of my heroes is the writer and thinker Malcolm Muggeridge, who made a similar journey to me from the hard left to the Catholic Church. He was born the son of H.T. Muggeridge, a communist activist and Labour councillor, founding member of the Fabian Society and the Labour MP for Rumford between 1929 and 1931.
I was waiting, anxiously on the lookout for him. With infinite relief, spotted him coming up the ramp. In those days, he was everything to me, the centre of my universe. More often than not, my father went straight to the town hall from the station. On rare occasions, I was permitted to sit in the public gallery to watch the borough council proceedings.
Ladies and gentlemen, His Worship the Mayor.
The mayor presided, and spread out before him were the aldermen and councillors, my father among them. In those days, the solitary socialist. They seemed a majestic body, though even then a vague sense of the absurdity of authority and its trappings began to afflict me.
Good evening. Is it your wish that I sign the minutes?
Feeling myself to be in touch with the established social order itself. This was its very citadel, and my father had breached it. In him the council had admitted to its deliberations its own destroyer. How I hung on his words when he rose to defend the virtuous trams against the villainous private enterprise buses. With what withering scorn he denounced the niggardly ratepayers' representatives, whose only concern was to keep down public spending.
Later in life, Malcolm became a prominent Catholic and perhaps the first Western person to bring Mother Teresa to the world's attention. He himself sees the ironic parallels between his own religious convictions and his parents' socialism.
My first clear memories of my father and his cronies plotting the overthrow of the capitalist system in the drawing room of our suburban house in South Croydon. As they talked, I seemed to hear a revolutionary mob, myself in the vanguard, making an assault on the Croydon Town Hall. Like the early Christians waiting for the end of the world, we waited for the end of the capitalist system.
Muggeridge's parents believed that there was a rottenness at the core of Western society, caused by capitalism and greed, their version of the devil. Later, as a Catholic, Muggeridge expressed the same attitude in subtly different terms.
I think a sense, an awareness of good and evil, and this was Solzhenitsyn's first point about Western society, was that this distinction between good and evil had gone. And this is, of course, true. There lies the heart of the whole thing, because it is only this awareness of good and evil, of God and the devil, of darkness and light, that enables people to have a sense of how they should behave, what their relationships with one another should be. And I personally think that you could understand the ethical muddle of the Western world today perhaps better than anything else by understanding what is the difference between men being equal and men being brothers. Equality is a fantasy. Men are not equal. But in the light of the Christian revelation and all that's come of that, the awareness of men being brothers is a reality.
Malcolm remembers an attempt by his parents and their communist friends to build an earthly Eden.
Some of my father's fellow socialists found his patient Fabian municipal tactics too slow and pedestrian for their taste. They travelled further afield, bicycling, ladies daringly in bloomers, men in Norfolk suits, as far as Gloucestershire to found a model colony at Whiteway. How blessedly far away seemed Croydon East and London Bridge. This was to be their Arcadia. Money, marriage, and other ills were to be abolished, and happiness based on brotherly cooperation to prevail. How has it all worked out? When in my 9th year I first came to the colony, I was recovering from a mild attack of TB. It seemed to be flourishing. Today the homesteads are in poor shape. Money, it seems, refused to be abolished. Marriage reared its ugly head. Brotherly love yielded to unbrotherly quarrelling. This kingdom of heaven on earth, like so many before it, failed to materialize.
But even if Muggeridge accepted that the Communist Brotherhood was a myth that did not work in practice, he remained committed to the notion of a religious brotherhood. What killed Muggeridge's faith in Marxism was living in Moscow as a journalist in the 1930s.
The economic depression hung over my spirits as it did over Lancashire. Increasingly, communism loomed up as the way of salvation, and Moscow as its heavenly city. I pined to be gone now.
He saw violence, poverty, inequality, and lies. Stalinism helped to create a lot of conservatives. Another one of my heroes is Frida Utley, who suffered greatly in the Russian workers' paradise. Her deeply moving story shows how many young idealists not only turned away from Marxism when they realized what it is like in practice, but also how rejection of Marxism birthed a new kind of politics, a cult of individual liberty and resistance to any kind of state interference at all. Frida was born in England in 1899. She went through an expensive boarding school education and passed the Cambridge University entrance examinations in 1914. But her family became bankrupt, so instead she had to work as a teacher to pay for her London University degree, and became a researcher at the LSE. After the failure of the British General Strike of 1926, she joined the Communist Party. Utley travelled to East Asia and wrote a book, Japan's Feet of Clay, which made her one of the leading voices in the communist movement. Then Frida fell in love with a Russian revolutionary. She moved to Moscow with him and discovered the reality of life under Soviet socialism. Her goddaughter Anne Crosby tells her story.
Frida Utley was his sister, and Frida Utley was the lover of a Russian journalist, which is Arkady, his name was. And my parents, when they went to Russia, saw a great deal of him. And that's why I say they caused trouble. They were extravagant, they were upper crust, they were high-handed. And he eventually, the story goes, they gave him a very bad name. And then when they'd all come home, and some years had passed, he smuggled a letter out to my father, Arkady, out of Russia, and he said to father, "You must come and fetch Frida." This was his mistress and my father's once sister-in-law. "You owe me this. It was partly your behaviour or something worth the effect that put me in my precarious position. I shall soon be sent to a gulag."
Frida's son John Basil Utley, born in Moscow in 1934, recalls many years later what he and his mother went through.
My father was Russian, my mother was English. I'm here because when I was born, they knew already Russian babies could not leave the country without special permission. So when I was born, my mother put me on her passport as a British, she was English, as a British subject. It was already dangerous then. They knew many people had been arrested. The handwriting was on the wall, and my father was arrested 2 years later. The secret police came at 2 o'clock in the morning, knock on the door. They spent 3 or 4 hours going through every bit of paper and book and everything in the small apartment. Everyone had small apartments. And then took my father away, and my mother never saw him again, nor even knew why he was arrested. There were never reasons given.
It's no wonder that Frida Utley's Marxist ideals took a serious blow from this cruel and arbitrary treatment. Her daughter-in-law Anne Crosby, whose own parents were upper-class English socialists, tells their side of the story as she knows it. Her father pretended to be the young John Basil Utley's dad in order to rescue him and his mother Frida and bring them home to England.
So father somehow fixed a document that looked convincing and pushed off to Russia. I think it was 1937, quite late, and brought Frida Utley back. And she lived with us. She was a nightmare. And father eventually, I don't know how he managed it, but he swung it to get her to America where she wanted to go.
Arriving in America, Frida continued to write prolifically, but her perspective changed radically.
And my mother had continued as a writer and wrote some of the first anti-communist books explaining what life was like in Russia. And she was connected then in Washington. Llewellyn Thompson was an former ambassador, asked Mikoyan, who was a top Soviet, what had happened to my father, if he could get a record. And we got a little letter from the Soviet embassy saying he had died in the state of Komi, that's northern Russia, this side of the Urals, with as big as France. I mean, that he died in 1938 in the state of Komi. That's all we knew.
In the 1940s, living in America, Frida expressed her disillusionment with Soviet Russia in a book she called The Dream We Lost. In the opening paragraphs, she preempted accusations that her story was motivated by personal pain caused by the arrest and death of her husband.
I shall perhaps be accused of being prejudiced by my personal experiences. So also, no doubt, have the victims of all tyrannies been prejudiced, whether they were slaves in the ancient world or heretics persecuted by the Inquisition or victims in Nazi concentration camps. My disillusionment did not, in any case, come suddenly as a result of my husband's arrest and imprisonment without trial in 1936. It was a disillusionment which had begun in 1930 and became more absolute with each month and year I lived in the USSR.
Indeed, Frida's beliefs turned against all varieties of state control and authority, not just Soviet.
Well, later my mother wrote on a book about the occupation in Germany. Then she was about the Chinese, the suffering. She was there in 1937. The Chinese at war, the misery in China. And later the Palestinians. I always grew up, and of course it was always criticized, I grew up my whole life thinking the minority was where one was supposed to be.
According to her goddaughter Anne Crosby, Frida was as ferocious on the right as she had been on the left.
She then became extremely right-wing, and she sold, as father put it, sold everyone down the river. My father and mother never could have gone back to America once she lived there. She blacklisted just about everybody who had belonged to that left-wing group in London in the McCarthy era.
Frida's son, John Basil, became a libertarian, a form of dissent and rebellion comparable to his mother's former communism. Today, he is as critical of his own government, America, as he is anyone else's. He is opposed to military intervention abroad, and he even makes apologies for the anti-government whistleblower, Edward Snowden.
Snowden, I mean, you have to say the secrets. Okay, what was betrayed was our methodology, how we get the secrets. And there's points, obviously, it goes too far. But the greatest enemy for most, this is where I come from, the great enemy, more people were killed in the 20th century by their own governments than by foreign governments. The threat we feel, with my libertarian, is really as much from our own government as it is from foreigners.
Fear and rejection of Soviet-style state-driven oppression was the central factor in shaping the libertarian ideas that became the doctrine of neoliberalism. Rising economic thinkers concluded that the smaller the government, the freer the people, which was once, we must remind ourselves, a very radical doctrine. It is perhaps no surprise that those who went to live in the Soviet Union were quickly disenchanted with Marxism in practice. But what do theoretical Marxists make of the right's portrait of Marxism? Enter Terry Eagleton, champion of living British Marxists, Marxians and Marxoids, and one who never veered towards the right.
Marx has, of course, been extraordinarily caricatured. I mean, one of the most travestied of writers, I think.
Terry Eagleton has some key points to make about how people who aren't Marxists tend to misunderstand what Marx thought.
First of all, the fact that he was, of course, a great champion of capitalism. You know, how many people in the BBC, for example, know that? That for Marx, the middle classes, the European middle classes who created capitalism, were the most, by far for him, the most revolutionary agent in history. In fact, Hannah Arendt said that the opening pages of the Communist Manifesto were an embarrassing paean of praise to capitalism. Yes, it had swept away, in an astonishingly brief period of time, almost every vestige of the ancien regimes.
Interesting to think of Marxism not as an enemy of the bourgeoisie, but as their champion. Eagleton also argues that the idea that Marxism is a statist ideology is, in fact, a misreading.
Marx, of course, was more hostile to the state than the Tea Party is. He was concerned with the individual, he was concerned with faceless and anonymous collectors. Marx was pretty wary of abstract theory.
Similarly, Marx's vision of work was a far cry from the grim, hard labour that came to be associated with socialist society.
Work must become a means of human fulfillment and gratification.
Terry Eagleton makes one further point which brings Marx's ideals even closer to those of some of his libertarian critics.
His ideal society, not that he talks about in those terms, would thus be pretty much like Oscar Wilde's in his great pamphlet, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where Wilde envisages the future really as just lounging around all day in loose crimson garments, sipping absinthe, reciting Homer to each other. And, Wilde was an aesthete and a socialist in a very logical kind of way, because he thought that the whole point ultimately of human existence was to realize one's powers and capacities purely for the hell of it.
Marx wanted to maximize people's freedom, not limit it, to help them make the most of their talents and even enjoy life. The mission of politics was to emancipate humanity's highest capacities. This idea of personal development, of self-fulfillment, finds expression among conservatives too. They're not that dissimilar.
I was never a kind of state ownership Marxist.
Listen, for example, to my fellow Telegraph columnist Janet Daly talking about the success of Thatcherism.
I became convinced that free market economics, it's just an empirical fact, free market economics has produced mass prosperity on a scale that is unprecedented in human history. More people are not only prosperous in the kind of crass materialistic sense, but they have self-determination and freedom of movement and freedom to improve their lives and personal worth, sense of self-worth that has never been possible before in human history. And that's been provided by free market economics.
But according to Eagleton, this understanding of capitalism as the greatest propeller of progress, wealth and science is in fact at the heart of Marx's thought, rather than being something he wanted to debunk or disprove.
What Marx does is take the great revolutionary bourgeois ideals of liberty and equality and fraternity with embarrassing seriousness and says, how come that they can never be realized in practice? What are the mechanisms which stymie the full realization of your own ideals? How come, for example, freedom for some means unfreedom for others, or equality for some means vast inequality for others, but how come?
Talk of human emancipation is a central element of both communists and radical Thatcherites. But Janet Daly took issue with Eagleton's proposition that Marx is a champion of self-determination.
You can find what you want in Marx about this, because there's the young Marx and the older Marx, and Marxism isn't quite the same as what Marx wrote either. And Marx, in his younger incarnation, was very much in favor of what we would call self-determination and self-fulfillment and so on. But then it all got hardened into that sort of Leninist picture of, and Engels was much more like this too, of the only possible personal development is through class consciousness. And that is what seemed to me so sinister. I thought that what I was fighting for was human freedom, human liberation. And then it turned out that the only kind of, and you actually get told this by your elders in the Marxist circles, it's not about your personal development, it's about class progress and class war and class ownership of the society. So you have to extinguish your personal individualistic impulses.
So Daly suggests that the main difference between Marxism and conservatism is a choice between the emancipation of a class or the emancipation of an individual, the collective versus the personal. Nevertheless, the language of freedom and of fulfillment is strikingly similar. You could even argue that modern conservatives have a lot in common with the idealistic, younger Karl Marx. In fact, we could ask if modern conservatives are really conservative at all. They sound an awful lot like radicals who want to free the individual from everything that oppresses them. Here is Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman, the greatest voice of the movement after Hayek.
I'm not a conservative. I never have been a conservative. Hayek was not a conservative. We are radicals. We want to get to the root of things. We are liberals in the true meaning of that term, of and concerned with freedom.
In the mid-20th century, the founders of this new brand of conservative economics, a libertarian economics called neoliberalism that rejected big government, found themselves in opposition to the post-war consensus. Western governments believed that capitalism had to be managed and the people cared for by a generous welfare state financed by taxation. The conservatives who opposed this were themselves regarded as revolutionaries, even madmen.
It's hard now to realize, looking back, how different the situation was in the world than it is now. Everywhere in the world, all of the emphasis was on central planning, on collectivism. Those few of us who believed in freedom and free markets, in minimum government, were regarded as nuts over on an extreme fringe of the intellectual scene. So you have to give Friedrich Hayek full credit.
And here is Hayek himself describing the dominant idea that he set out to defeat.
Well, it's a very interesting story intellectually. One of the dominant ideas which governs thinking since the 18th century is the idea that we can make everything to our pleasure, that we can design social institutions in their working.
Hayek, as we heard at the top of this programme, was the author of The Road to Serfdom, and the impact of that book cannot be underestimated. Milton Friedman.
Over the years, I've gone around and asked people who had shifted from a belief in central government, in socialism, in what today goes by the name of liberalism, what led them to shift? What led them to an understanding that that was a wrong road? And over again, the answer has been the road to serfdom.
For Milton Friedman, the war against socialism was eternal and on all fronts, and very hard to win.
The really troublesome thing is what I mentioned earlier. Everybody is persuaded that socialism is a failure. And yet in practice, we keep moving down the socialist road. When Hayek's book was published in 1944, or just, let's take, not 44, but take 46 or 50, just after the end of the war, government was much smaller in the United States than it is today. If I remember the numbers, government spending at all levels, federal, state, and local, was about 25% of the national income. Today it's 45%. And that doesn't allow for the effect, not of spending, but of regulations. The Clean Air Act, the Aid to Disabilities Act, and so on. So that, in fact, we are more than half socialist today.
Listening to Milton Friedman's account of the errors of socialism, it is tempting to accuse him of erecting a rather simplified straw man.
Because the story they tell is a very simple story, easy to sell. If there's something bad, it must be an evil person who's done it. If you want something done, you've got to do it. You've got to have government step in and do it.
And as inaccurate a portrait of socialism as that may sound to anyone who considers themselves a sympathiser, the fact is that in the battle of ideas that the Conservatives launched against Marxist and socialist principles, and the state more broadly, these simplifications resonated and stuck. The idea that freedom exists only where the state is absent became regarded as common sense, to the extent that we may find it difficult to remember that it was not always so. Listen to Keith Joseph, who would become Margaret Thatcher's guru, talking about Britain's slide to the left in the 1960s.
And I realized with a shock that what I had been the whole while was a sort of semi-socialist. I thought I was a Tory, and now I realize that we've got to try to hand back more decisions to the people. We've got to trust the people. There will still remain an enormous amount for the government to do. But now the government is overwhelmed. It's trying to do far too much and is doing it very badly. Since the end of the Second World War, we've had altogether too much socialism. For half of those 30 years, conservative governments, for understandable reasons, didn't consider it practicable to reverse the vast accumulation of socialism they found on returning to office. So the result is that we're now more socialist in many ways than any other developed country outside the communist bloc.
Keith Joseph and the early Thatcherites found this consensus to be pervasive and deadening. Every triumph for evil was, in their view, a defeat for good.
We pursued the middle ground, but the middle ground proved to be a will-o'-the-wisp. As we moved towards it, it moved away from us. Every concession we made to the socialists was used by them to press the center of gravity leftwards, to push the ratchet another notch along.
In fact, Marx and those who remade the right in the post-war years share one common ancestor, the Scottish political economist Adam Smith.
Adam Smith was the founder of modern economics.
Adam Smith's most famous idea is that the exchange of goods is regulated on a scale beyond that of individual calculation, by what he called an invisible hand. And though that expression only turns up once in the book The Wealth of Nations, it is inevitably the one idea that comes up whenever his legacy is discussed. Marx and the Conservatives both agree that it exists, but Marx hates it and the Conservatives love it. In The German Ideology, Marx writes,
"Or how does it happen that trade rules the whole world through the relation of supply and demand? A relation which, as an English economist says, hovers over the earth like the fate of the ancients, and with invisible hand allots fortune and misfortune to men. While with the abolition of the basis of private property, with the communistic regulation of production, the power of the relation of supply and demand is dissolved into nothing, and men get exchange, production, the mode of their mutual relation, under their own control again."
So, for Marx, the invisible hand is an unwelcome, tyrannical regulator of the existences of people, setting everything to the arbitrary tune of market relations. Much better, he believes, to abolish this rule, along with property, and put ourselves in control of our destiny. Friedrich Hayek, of course, disagrees.
The market is I was going to say most ingenious, but ingenious without having been designed, instrument which enables us to utilize knowledge which is distributed among hundreds and thousands of people. It's an adaptation to thousands of circumstances which nobody ever can know as a whole, and where the prices formed on the market tell the individual what to do and what not to do in the social interest.
So while for Marx markets, or the capitalist system as he would call it, induced complex mechanisms of oppression, for Hayek and Friedman the markets ensured freedom, and any attempt to control them would inevitably put individuals in bondage to the tyrannical state. Milton Friedman.
I was in communist China, and I had an interview with Zhou Ziyang, who was at that time the General Secretary of the Communist Party. And he described the policy of his government as that we want the market to control the economy and the government to control the market. As I told him then, and as I will tell you now, that is a complete contradiction in terms. The crucial thing about the market is that power comes from the bottom up. It comes from the individual up to the market. The crucial thing about government is that power comes from the top down. You're mixing oil and water. If you think a government from the top can control a market which is being run from the bottom. The problem with that view is not the objectives. I share their objectives. But they simply are unrealistic in believing that they can effectively make the market dance to the tune of what they regard as their better values.
This was the historic battle that the neoliberals saw. The free market and individualism on one side, the state and Marxism on the other. It was a struggle that, for British Conservatives, reached a peak in the 1970s. Here is Lord Lawson, who later served as Chancellor under Margaret Thatcher, explaining the contemporary relevance of Hayek.
Hayek gave a kind of explanation of why what had gone wrong was going wrong. It does chime in with Hayek right back in the 1940s, saying that the path we're on at the moment is the road to serfdom. Hayek gave an alternative vision, which seemed to me to be very cogent. What it boiled down to was freedom within the rule of law.
The situation in 70s Britain looked bleak. Unemployment was high, taxes were punishing, inflation was rampant, and industrial strife had brought the economy to a standstill. This was Friedrich Hayek's diagnosis and prescription.
I think the first problem for Britain at the present moment is to freeze the way for new developments by reducing the coercive powers of the trade unions.
Meanwhile, on the global scene, it felt as if the Soviet Union had the upper hand. The Americans had beat a hasty retreat from Vietnam. Countries in Asia and Africa were falling to communism. Moscow and Washington trained nuclear weapons on each other, and the battle of ideas was waged with strong words.
And if I lose liberty, then it takes away the basic reason for living.
So what is
if you're the sort of person who doesn't mind about having any liberty, provided you've got a house and food coming to you and you will do what you're told to do, then perhaps you won't mind. I suppose it's the difference between being born free and living life like an animal at the zoo in a cage.
Yeah.
Thatcher was speaking to the famous American conservative journalist William F. Buckley when she was still opposition leader.
The activity of the present government, which is to put more and more powers into the hands of the state, and therefore to take more and more away from the citizen. And I think in the end, you know, that is the final divide.
Of course, some people took this line of argument with a pinch of salt. Here's the left-wing journalist Christopher Hitchens.
Britain, since 1945, has been a very, very heavily state-run economy, but also a very, very capitalist one. And another point of interest about Thatcherism has been this, that she believes that Britain has been, in a sense, a socialist collectivist society, really since Churchill ceased to be Prime Minister in 1945. Now, the fact that that's a nonsensical opinion and doesn't fit with any known fact or any known theory doesn't quite rob it of its power, because it's certainly true that there was a lot of inefficient public ownership, a great deal of what I would call craft unionism, trade unions simply acting as syndicates for the protection of members, what you might call on the waterfront trade unionism in some cases. Thus, one has to say that at least in theory, Thatcher does believe that everybody should take their chances and believes in meritocracy rather than in hierarchy, and so forth. But I regard that as basically for public consumption. I think you will find, in fact, that the tax breaks that she's given to those who already are well off and to the businesses that are already in place haven't been rewarded by further investment.
Christopher Hitchens might not have been buying it, but after being elected Prime Minister in 1979, Margaret Thatcher did a good job of traducing the idea that the government was here to help. Labour politician Peter Shaw.
I think what we've seen in the last 10 years is a very substantial, as it were, cultural revolution in the country, which Mrs. Thatcher's undoubtedly been one of her achievements, if one can call it that. But certainly she has discredited the idea of the state, and she's represented the state as a great monster, enveloping and stifling, the enterprise of the community.
And here is Ralph Harris, who led the Institute of Economic Affairs, one of the early promoters of the economic doctrines of the new conservative position.
What really bugged us in the 50s and 60s, it was the assumption that governments had lots of solutions, and if you arm governments with powers, it went back to the 40s, by the way, whereby the assumption was that we had won the war through planning and central control and the civil service, this immaculate conception of this priestly caste of civil servants who would take care of all of that background presupposed governments having not merely a major but dominant, unlimited role in all sections of economic and social policy. So that the notion of, in Thatcher's crude terms, getting the state off our back was music to our ears.
This plan to release the forces of the free market was as opposed to old-fashioned paternalist types of conservatism as it was to socialism. Tory MP Peter Lilly.
In the past, the Conservative Party was essentially offering a slow boat along the same route that the socialists were urging that we travel rapidly. We were just going to try and move as gradually towards socialism as we possibly could, but we accepted the direction and the path which they had ordained. Now Mrs. Thatcher is saying that we're going to travel in the other direction, that we want less bureaucracy, a more open, freer economy, less control over individuals' lives.
The men and women who wanted to get the state off people's backs became known as the New Right, in deference to the fact that they were as new to the right wing as they were to the left. Today we tend to call them neoliberals, and they spoke to a new individualistic, meritocratic form of classless society, once again undercutting socialists on the road to utopia.
They think it's attractive to offer to the young a future wholly controlled by the operation of the socialist state. What is their message? To each his own pigeonhole, from each total conformity. We utterly reject it.
It was precisely this promise that seduced Janet Daly away from the radical left.
It seemed to me one of the reasons I was a Labour voter originally, even though I'd ceased to be a Marxist, I was a Labour voter. But then it dawned on me that what Labour was saying to working class people was, stay where you are and we'll look after you. It was paternalistic and condescending. And what I wanted said, it turned out, is what Margaret Thatcher said. You can do this. If you have talent and you have ambition and you're prepared to work hard, you can succeed. You can come out, you can buy your own home, you can start your own business, you can do all the things that you've always been told in the past working class people couldn't do. And we want to help you do that. And that was what was so appealing to me. I voted Conservative for the first time in 1979.
That's what Thatcher set out to deliver. Over 11 years in government, she privatised state companies, cut taxes, deregulated, and tried to set the individual free.
I believe you won't keep political freedom unless you also have economic freedom, which means that you must have a large part of free enterprise in your whole economy.
Politically, the Marxists were her best friends. Militant trades unionists became her bogeymen, the enemy within.
I will never negotiate with people who use coercion and violence to achieve their objective. They are the enemies of democracy. They are not interested in the future of democracy. They are trying to kill democracy for their own purposes.
As the Soviet Union declined, withered and died, Thatcherism looked not only like an alternative to socialism, but the only alternative. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989.
Within hours of East Germany's decision to let its people go by opening the border to the west, the city erupted in a frenzy of celebration.
Conservatism had won its historic battle against Marxism, and Marxism's claim to be a historical force of progress was proved completely wrong. Lord Lawson speaking in 2012.
We did institute a radical change of policy direction, which has not really been reversed. It may have been muddied, but it hasn't been reversed.
And indeed, Thatcher's key principles were still guiding our political decisions well into the 2000s. Listen to her last speech in the Commons in 1990.
And I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! So long as the group is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer. You do not create wealth and opportunity that way. You do not create a property-owning democracy that way.
The ideal of a meritocracy in which trickle-down trumps redistribution lived on in Tony Blair and New Labour.
We're still a long way from a society in which the way that people get on is through merit rather than privilege, and where there's genuine equality of opportunity, which is what I want to see.
Blair in 1996. Notice how Blair, like Friedman, speaks of equality of opportunity. Hardly shocking to our ears, but a far cry from the old Labourite ideal of equality full stop. And Blair uses the language of merit, which is the language of radical individualism. One political scientist dubbed this the end of history. From now on, almost every serious political party in the West would have the same fundamental commitments to capitalism and neoliberalism, to free trade, low taxes, and even free movement of labour. The consensus seemed unshakable. So how did we get to this?
Free trade can be wonderful if you have smart people, but we have people that are stupid.
Today, Western politics is dominated by populists like Donald Trump. Trump is in many ways your typical conservative. He wants to cut taxes and help business. But in other ways, he represents a rejection of neoliberalism. Donald Trump would spend more taxpayers' money on roads and rail. He would protect welfare programs. He wants to protect American goods from foreign competition, and he is critical of immigration. Neoliberals, by contrast, tend to be sympathetic towards the migrant. Here is Milton Friedman talking from a textile factory in New York in his iconic 1980 TV series, Free to Choose.
The people who live and work here are like the early settlers. They want to better their lot, and they're prepared to work hard to do so.
The people who are here now, they are like my mother, mostly immigrants from a distant country. They came here because they liked it here better and had more opportunities. A place like this gives them a chance to get started. They're not going to stay here very long or forever. On the contrary, they and their children will make a better life for themselves as they take advantage of the opportunities that a free market provides to them.
Karl Marx was a migrant. Frieda Utley was a migrant. Isn't the freedom of the individual to move from one country to another the ultimate libertarian value, and the desire to uplift your family through hard work very conservative? That's not the way Donald Trump sees it.
They're going to be gone, okay? And they're going to be gone fast. They're called illegal immigrants, and they're here illegally. They're going to have to go, and they're going to have to come back in legally. And if we don't do that, we don't have a country.
Donald Trump's pledge to secure his country's borders is popular across the Western world. Marxism and neoliberalism were primarily interested in how to make everyone more money. But this new politics is also interested in national identity, culture, and the fear of the other.
We're not interested in getting a whole lot of people who we're supposed to integrate, but we know as a fact that it is impossible. The immigrants which have come and their second generation are more crime prone, and we have a rising Islamic problem in Denmark.
That was a Danish People's Party MP. And in Hungary, Holland, France, nationalist parties are gaining traction. And it is a sign of how fast things are changing that in the French presidential election, the centre-right's candidate, François Fillon, a self-professed Thatcherite, will probably be opposing not a socialist, but a populist nationalist. For Marine Le Pen, the populist movement is an insurgence against the impersonal forces of the market so cherished by the neoliberals, against the invisible hand of the economy and those of faraway politicians.
Yes, the answer is yes. There is something going on in the world. The rise of the peoples and the will of the people, both against supranational powers like the European Union and against the great financial powers, and against a system which for too long has defended particular interests and has forgotten to defend the interests of the peoples. And that's Trump, but it's Sanders also. It's Brexit, and all these referendums within the EU that show it being rejected.
Le Pen has become very popular among former supporters of the French Communist Party, and it is surely in a deliberate effort to appeal to them that she mentions Bernie Sanders, an American socialist, as part of the global movement that she claims to represent. Today's populist right is no longer obsessed with socialism or deconstructing the state. They have found a new enemy within.
I think Islam hates us.
One development that shows how much neoliberalism is in trouble is the fate of the EU.
What's absolutely clear is that Eurozone membership is completely incompatible with nation-state democracy.
The EU itself was born out of a desire to enshrine free markets, and it gained much of its ideological cohesion from the Soviet threat. Hungarian PM Viktor Orbán.
For us, the European Union earlier was equal to the West, the desired West.
Without the fear of a powerful competing system, once kept alive by Marxist intellectuals, powerful communist parties and the Soviet Union, a united free marketeering Europe suddenly seems less compelling, less necessary.
And I think there's a trend developing right across Europe that Eurosceptic parties are going to get stronger and stronger.
That was Nigel Farage speaking in 2013, and boy was he correct. It increasingly feels as if neoliberalism might be on the brink of its own Berlin Wall-style moment. The conservatism that most of us have lived with up until now had been shaped by its opposition to Marxism. In the 1970s, it came to power seeking to contain, maybe even defeat the far left, and it succeeded. Neoliberalism vanquished its enemy and, for a few years, was loosened across the world. But maybe that victory was Pyrrhic. Without a bad guy to oppose, it lost some of its reason to be, and voters started shopping around for alternatives. And I also suspect that neoliberalism made the mistake of imitating some Marxist traits. That belief that it could build utopia, which inevitably led to disappointment when it failed to deliver. The tendency to paint the world in terms of good versus evil, which makes it harder in the long run to compromise. Most of all, the neoliberal right has obviously fallen out of touch with the real needs of the people it claims to represent. Marxism did not create wealth for the workers. Neoliberalism, it is felt, has tended to only make the rich richer. People complain that they don't feel free so much as imprisoned by forces beyond their control, like trade and immigration. Conservatism will have to change again to meet the new challenges of this century. I've no doubt that it can. One of history's great ironies is that conservatism, which has so often been dismissed as backwards-looking and archaic, is far better at adapting to new challenges than its progressive rivals.